Today we're fortunate to have Robert Phillips with us. Robert is at the University of Richmond in the Robbins School of Business. He got his PhD from the Darden School at the University of Virginia, and he's well published, especially in the area of stakeholder theory, in journals such as the Journal of Business Ethics Quarterly, Business and Social Responsibility, and Robert is an associate editor for Business and Society. He comes to us with a wealth of knowledge in the area of business ethics, and we'll get right to the point. I have a question for you, Robert. You know, I often hear students engage in rationalization, trying to diffuse their responsibility as it relates to business ethics decisions. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so if you do this job long enough, you'll hear pretty much the same arguments over and over from students. And the tricky part about it is that these are sometimes rationalizations and sometimes really good reasons. And so it turns out that things like, if I don't do it, someone else will, or that's just the way they do things around here, or everybody else is doing it. All of these things have an element of importance to them. But the problem is that if you just look at these arguments unreflectively, then they can be taken for the end of an argument rather than the beginning of a thought process that says, who is the everybody else who's really doing it? And what percentage of the population has to be doing something before it counts as everyone else is doing it, right? So where on the one hand, it is important to follow social norms of whatever community you're talking about, it can be a conversation stopper. And so what I try to do with my students is run them through the rationalizations that they're likely to use and point out the dangers that this can get them into, where these things cease to be relevant or important considerations, and point out the dangers. And so sometimes the way I phrase it is, here's what you'll be saying to yourself right before you make some questionable ethics decision. And rationalizations is one way to think about that.
Hey, thanks for your response to that question, but I have another one. Could you explain how organizations should train their employees to deal with the natural environment, cultural relativism, other issues such as that?
There are things you have to learn that bear rote memorization, that you really just have to sit down and battle with and memorize and figure out how it fits. I'm just not sure that dealing with something like cultural relativism or really ethical decision making is in that class of things. That's not to say that there aren't sort of common mistakes that people make, and I think that that's right, and we can learn from those, learn what not to do. But in general, trying to figure out what to do is not the sort of thing that will resolve itself with a list of thou shalt nots. So what I think is very helpful is something like case method. So that's the way I try to do the bulk of my class. That's the way I was trained to do it. And that is try to put yourself in the position of an executive or of a business person, an organizational leader who's trying to make these kinds of decisions. And try to examine the sorts of considerations that they would make. And so when it comes to cultural relativism, listening to other people explain what looks like a foreign culture to you and the rationales behind that culture, there can be a lot of value in that. So something that looks like a bad idea, something that looks wrong to you, once you understand the full context behind that, it helps you appreciate the reasons, I suppose, for those cultural norms. Now, that doesn't mean that some of those norms might not be still wrong or inferior or worthy of re-examination themselves, but that's where the discourse comes in. That's where the case method, trying to proxy what other people might have done, and trying to expose yourself to arguments from different cultures, really just is a substitute in a way, or at least a practice for experience. It's not actual experience, and there's some things in life that you just have to learn on the fly, on the job. But if you put yourself in those positions enough times, then at least you have that foundation, that framework to understand the other people's norms, and hopefully that will at least speed up the process.
We understand that you address your students from time to time about questionable ethical situations that they're going to be involved in. Let's start off with this one. We've often heard that students say, well, I was told this is how things are done around here. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so this is how things are done in this company is a smaller version of cultural relativism. So one of the interesting things about cultural relativism is that it can be addressed at any level of abstraction, anywhere from just your department, so the engineers and the marketers do things differently, all the way up to the more standard cultural relativism that we think of. So people in China do things differently from the way people might do them in Iowa. So the way things are done in this company is just a variation on that conversation. So, for example, there's a good case called Martha McCaskey out of the Harvard bibliography, and one of the issues there seems to me to have to do with the norms that occur in the either the competitive intelligence gathering industry and the semiconductor industry, and both of them do have somewhat specialized norms that might bear on the question of what should be done in the case.
What about when a student would say, I just do what I was told?
Yeah, I'm just doing what I'm told is custom made for the Milgram obedience experiments discussion. So you show the students in vivid detail exactly what can happen when you just follow orders more or less blindly. Now, that's not to say that there's not a coordinative function played by doing what other people tell you to do, and this is very important, and part of that discussion bears that out. And so I typically open that discussion just with the question, why do you do what other people tell you to do? And then we make a list on the board of the various reasons that people do what other people tell them to do. And strangely to me, especially in a business school classroom, one of the last things to come up very often is money. And that's always interesting, because if you ask people more pointedly, why do you get up and go to work in the morning or something like that, they'll very often, money will be the first thing that comes to their mind. But when placed in this broader context, why do you do what other people tell you to do? And in my case, I will say, why did you read that case last night? I assume you wouldn't have done that if I hadn't told you to. And it opens up their thinking to why people do what other people tell them to do and what the good reasons are. And then after talking about the Milgram experiments a little bit, they recognize that this can also be taken too far. So once again, like the other rationalizations that we've been talking about, there's an important kernel of truth, but it's the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation.
Very often I hear the expression, hey, it's not lying. In business, you have to do some bluffing or a little bit of puffery to gain competitive advantage.
Yeah, there's the now pretty dated but nevertheless classic case about business bluffing that I think comes up comes in handy in this context. But more generally, it comes up in a lot of context around negotiations of various sorts. Um, for the most part, anytime I hear students saying it's not blank, it's just this other sort of more innocuous term, that for me always raises a red flag, right? Anytime you have to recast what you're doing as something that makes you feel better about it, then you probably have something there that you don't feel particularly good about. Actually, the one that I find most entertaining is we'll talk about resumes and whether or not you lie on your resume or whether or not you're bluffing your resume whenever you puff it up. And the one that I hear very often is it's not lying, I'm just marketing myself. And to me, that's remarkable because I think it essentially casts aspersions on the entire field of marketing right there, more or less uh, creating an equivalence between marketing and lying. And that's a whole broader conversation about the role of marketing and trying to get people to do things that they might not otherwise do. But in general, anytime, going back to the original question, anytime I hear somebody say, it's not the bad thing, it's just this other more innocuous thing, to me, that's the sort of thing that ought to raise red flags for anyone who finds themselves saying that.
And finally, what would you say is the difference between a business decision and what we might call a business ethics decision?
This one's pretty straightforward. Business decisions affect other people and their well being. And sometimes a lot of people, and sometimes with significant effects on their well being and the bases of self esteem and so forth. That sounds to me an awful lot like the definition of an ethics decision, decisions that affect other people, sometimes in significant ways, sometimes large numbers of people. So if they have more or less the same definition, then I don't see how you can separate a business decision from an ethics decision. Basically, every business decision is an ethics decision.
Robert, we do appreciate you joining us here today at the University of New Mexico and sharing your insights on some important business ethics issues. I think we will all gain a lot from your insights, and we look forward to the next time we can get together.